Welcome in to another edition, a season opener edition of the Game Plan Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Ashley. That's Greg Barnes beside me. Doc Staples is here. He is in transit. Life happens no matter what. Football season, college football season. Of course, if you see Doc Staples there, you see nothing. Kind of reminds you what you see right now on ESPN if you have Spectrum. It's gone for a while. Greg, did you know that?
I did not know that.
And indeed, Spectrum and Disney are in a fight. So anybody that was watching an ESPN game tonight had a blank screen or a note that said basically they were in a fight. But I digress. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com. North Carolina, South Carolina, Saturday night in Bank of America Stadium. Greg, I entitled this show Critical Opener for the Tar Heels. I think it is a very critical opener for North Carolina here in year 5 of Mack Brown's 2.0. Your overall thoughts before we dig into it?
Well, my number one thought is this, Tommy. When I look at this depth chart for North Carolina, as you mentioned, we are in year number 5 under Mack Brown. This is a veteran bunch. I mean, this is a stacked depth chart. I mean, they've got 4 players at multiple positions. Obviously, they got 5 at running back, but they got 4 at linebacker, 4 at jack, 4 at wide receiver, 3 a lot of the defensive back positions. I'm going to make a proclamation right now, Tommy, to start the year on the game plan. The rebuild is over. And I think you have to give Mack Brown a lot of props. He's done a very good job recruiting since he came back in November of 2018. We knew that he would. That's what he's known for, right? And so all the talk about Carolina being inexperienced and young and having to fill gaps, they've been successful in doing that. Now, that doesn't mean North Carolina has arrived, right? You still need to improve your talent base. You still need to get better in certain areas, both in terms of coaching and how the coaching staffs may be constructed. There's always going to be tweaks there. There's always going to be tweaks with the roster. But in terms of having a program in place where you can weather injuries and suspensions and all those kind of things, North Carolina is in very good shape. So the rebuild is over. Now it's a matter of, okay, we know we have the foundation in place. Let's build upon that. And that's what this year is about, Tom. I mean, you talk about this first game being so important. South Carolina had a great close to last season. They were not a great team last year. And I think when you look at some of the pieces that they lost, I don't see this team really competing for the SEC East. This is a team that should get to a bowl game, so it's going to be a worthy opponent. But this is a game that North Carolina should win. And this is why this game is so important. It's really a benchmark opportunity for North Carolina to say, hey, we understood we closed the season poorly last year. We lost 4 straight games, lost 2 games they never should have lost, and really got embarrassed by Clemson in the ACC championship game. It's an opportunity for Mack Brown and his program to say, we're better than that. We're going to be much more like the team that started 9-1. And this is their showcase. This is an opportunity in the Carolinas at Bank of America Stadium to say, we're done playing second fiddle to some of these other programs in the Carolinas. We're going to be the top program, if not one of the top programs moving forward. And they can say a lot of things about that dynamic with a win on Saturday night.
Jason, Greg sort of set the bar right there for these game plan podcasts with his monologue there, and I agree with everything he said. It's time for North Carolina to put up, and that opportunity comes Saturday. Your just overall thoughts going into this one. It just feels like a big game. I'll reiterate that. It feels like a big game for Mack Brown, a big game for the North Carolina program. Playing an SEC school, playing a neighbor to the south, playing all, rivalry, whatever we want to call it. Your overall take, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, I think it's an enormous game, and for a lot of the same reasons that Greg Barnes just laid out for us. Very simple. You've got a veteran team now at a lot of the key spots. You have no excuses on the defensive line. You have no excuses, I think, at this point in the secondary with the corners and safeties being veterans and having brought in some transfer talent. You've developed and you've recruited well at running back. You've got guys at wide receiver who can play. This is the kind of game that you need to win. Like Greg said, if you're going to be a team that is hoping to contend for your conference, and then you're going to play against a team that, look, I know they're in the same division as Georgia, so probably nobody other than Georgia is really contending for that division. But I'm not sure that they're really a contender for the number 2 spot in that division. And that's not the strongest division in college football. The SEC East is not super strong aside once you get below Georgia. This is a game you've got to win, and it's a game that really sets the tone for the season. You've got to be able to handle that and do it well.
Greg, to Jason's point there, setting the tone for the season, we saw in 15 that Carolina lost to South Carolina, same setup, and then went on a run. It doesn't feel the same this year. A couple things that I find interesting, and then I want to hear more from you. Mack Brown's first game at North Carolina in '88 was against South Carolina. Mack Brown's first game back against South Carolina in Bank of America Stadium. Mack talked about the game a couple of years ago that he will live with for the rest of his days. I think a lot of us will after watching that one, especially being in the stands for that one. British Brooks' last football game he's played was against South Carolina in that bowl game. Tamari Fox, same thing. Just so many narratives going on for North Carolina here in this game. Drake Maye, of course, the Tez Walker situation, which I'm kind of talked out of on that one. But just what would it mean as far as setting the tone for this team for this season? Not the program, but for this season, how important is it in that regard? And Greg is muted. I get to say it a bunch.
Rusty, man. Jeez. I think there's a lot of parallels from how this off season has played out to the 2021 preseason, right? Because you had a pretty good team the previous year that returned a lot of pieces. You've got a quarterback, one of the best in the country, a Heisman candidate, at least that kind of conversation coming into the year, and a lot of expectation. Now, that team was preseason number 10. This team is right at number 20. So not quite the level of hype. But what happened in that game, of course, is that North Carolina goes into Blacksburg, and they were not prepared for the moment. Virginia Tech was not a very good team that year. They smacked them, and Carolina really never recovered and ended up with a losing record that year. And so I think there's this opportunity for the coaching staff, and they have done this, to say, look, we understand there's some preseason hype, but this is a brand new team. What you did last year, winning those 9 games, does not matter. You can't think about last year. You can only think about what we're doing right now in the season ahead. And so I really think it's that mental hurdle for this team. Drake Maye didn't play that year, but he was around it. He understood what took place. But you were able to go on a big stage against a pretty good opponent, maybe not an elite team, but a good opponent, and show what you're worth and how good you actually are. That doesn't mean this is going to be a pretty game. I mean, first games rarely are, right? But if you do enough things right to be able to win the game, then you can take a sigh of relief. Then you can say, okay, we got the first one under our belt, and kind of build some momentum. Dean Smith always talked about once you get into the season or once you get into the postseason, that's when you start building momentum. You can't do it before you actually play. And that's why Saturday's so important. It's really this opportunity for North Carolina to hit the ground running. And that's why it's so important. And yeah, I mean, if you lose this game, well, you got another tough game next week, right? With App State. And then you got Minnesota coming to town. And then you got to go to Pitt. So it doesn't get any easier, especially if you drop the first one. But win the first one, get some confidence, and then you can get things starting to roll.
Jason, from a former player and actually a coach on the high school level, how difficult is it to be dialed in I mean, exactly like you need to be going into the opening game. We've talked about opening games are sloppy. Max referred to them as crapshoots. You don't know what you're going to get a lot of times. How difficult is that aspect of it for a coaching staff to get their guys 100% all in and all on the same page right out of the gate, especially since they do not hit as much in practice. They do not have preseason games. A lot going into an opener that we've talked about is a pretty big one for North Carolina.
Yeah, I think you said a lot of things that already sort of answer that question. One of the first being that you don't do as much hitting in camp as you used to. Teams used to come into camp or come out of camp and they'd be pretty swollen and bruised and battered and all of that, but they'd sure be ready to hit and tackle that next opponent, that first opponent. Now, game one tends to be, if you look around the country, teams miss a lot of tackles in game one. You see more missed tackles week one than you do week two, and then way more in week one than you do in week three. And by the end of the year, teams are playing better defense. So generally speaking, it's harder for teams to be ready out of the gate on defense, just because of the way that practices are run, the way that programs are run, the rules, the way that they work now. I think that's very hard. I think it's hard to be in the full mode of physicality that you expect to be going into a game for that game one game. And the hardest thing to balance is you want to be really, really physical. You want to play that way. But, after a month of hitting everybody, when you are hitting, you're thudding, you're doing a lot of those things. After a month of seeing nobody but your teammates, you're really eager to go and hit somebody else. And then the danger there is that produces its own kind of sloppiness. I mean, the other thing about week one is you're having to really tell your guys to manage their emotions. It's similar to a higher stakes game in other respects, your championship type games, that sort of thing, in that respect. And that, it's the first time you've been back on the field with, real stakes in a while. And it's really easy to get, and, people talk about, oh, this team came out flat or whatever. Most teams, when they play poorly, early on or that sort of thing, a lot of times it's not that they came out flat or unemotional. It's that they came out over emotional and wound up basically spending all that energy, all that adrenaline on the first, couple plays. And then, they're not ready to go after that. And that's one of the things you're really trying to prepare your team for is, okay, get that out of your system on the first kickoff, but, we've got to lock in, and you're emphasizing do your job in the first game. That's the thing is how much can you make sure that your fundamentals do not break down in game one, and that's the hard part.
Yeah, Greg, when we look at the rosters, you mentioned North Carolina and their veteran. I mean, you've got offensive line, this super veteran. Drake Maye's only started one season, but we know what he can do. You've got a running back room. And on the defensive side, we've talked about it all offseason and all preseason camp. It's time for their rankings, their recruiting rankings to pay off. But flip it to the other side. I know you've been digging into South Carolina a little bit. Obviously, Spencer Rattler's one of those guys that gets all the talk. They've got some young skill guys that are great. But as far as looking at the game itself, where does it sort of favor North Carolina in the matchup? Position by position or position against position, wherever you want to take this, where does North Carolina have some advantages here?
Well, one thing that we've talked about for years, Tommy, and I think anybody that watches football, whether it be the pros or college, understands this. This is not breaking news, right? You've got to win in the trenches. And one of the advantages that North Carolina has is really on both lines. Now, was Carolina elite along the offensive line or defensive line last year? No, they were not. Offensive line was fine. Defensive line was really a mess. They were just not effective whatsoever. But they get everybody back. Of course, the offensive line lost Austin Richards to the NFL. And you do lose a couple pieces along the Carolina defensive front, but pretty much all those guys are back other than Fahasik and Noah Taylor. And so a lot of benefits there in terms of having guys that have played a lot of snaps. South Carolina, on the other hand, they're talking a big game about the offensive line in the preseason about they're going to be fine. They lost a lot. They're relying on some pieces that were not playing a lot of quality snaps at other places, lower level schools. I mean, they're relying on a guy from Yale to start. They're relying on a guy from Charlotte to play a lot of snaps. Western Illinois, I believe, is the other kid. So there's a lot of holes along the offensive front that they're going to need guys to really step up and play well. And that wasn't a very good offensive line last year. So you have the mindset of, well, it couldn't get much worse, right? Which is kind of what you can say about Carolina's defensive front. But defensive line-wise, they lost some key pieces too. And they do feel pretty good about the defensive line. I think that's a better unit than their offensive line. Now, can North Carolina, to your point, play better than what they showed last year? I think that's the big question. They have a new offensive line coach. They like him. They think he fits very well with what Chip Lindsey wants to do. And then Monachino came in as a advisor to help Tim Cross with the defensive line. And I think those are the opportunities for North Carolina to really set the tone for the year of like, hey, we're actually going to win the line of scrimmage in this game because we should. And if Carolina can do that, then they're going to win this game probably by more than a touchdown.
Whew, big words there, Doc Staples from Greg Barnes on it. Where's North Carolina have the advantages here, Jason? When you look at the matchups, what can North Carolina fans sort of feel good about? I guess if you want to put it some way against this South Carolina team.
Well, it depends a little bit on how Spencer Rattler plays because and which one steps on the field. And I do want to see him with a different offensive coordinator because I was not really impressed by Satterfield last year and how they ran some things. I'm curious to see what happens now. I mean, this coordinator, the new coordinator, Loganes, I think is how you say his name, is a he's a Sam Pittman guy, and I think Pittman's a really good coach, and I'm curious to see what they do there. But the reason that I say I'm curious on the quarterback side is, and this could be a disadvantage or an advantage for Carolina, because Rattler last year and at different points in his career was a turnover machine at times. I mean, you look at the turnover-worthy plays. That's something I pay attention to in the Pro Football Focus metrics that they put together. This is one of those where you can look at interceptions, right? A guy throws so many interceptions on the year, and that's a to some degree a measure of how accurate or how good a decision maker that quarterback was. But some of that's just luck. You throw a pass that hits a defender in the hands, squirts through the defender's hands, and winds up being caught by your guy in the end zone, and that goes down as a touchdown. But that should have been a turnover. Well, the nice thing that Pro Football Focus does is they mark that down and they say that ball should have been intercepted. That's a turnover-worthy play. So, thing is, Rattler's one of those guys who at times can be really sloppy with it. He had last year a 4.4% turnover-worthy play rate. Now, just to put that in comparison, last year Drake Maye had a 2.4% turnover-worthy play rate. If we want to get even more granular, last year Bryce Young at Alabama had 9 turnover-worthy plays in 12 games. Okay, 9.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's wild. Spencer Rattler had 6 against Clemson and Notre Dame in the last 2 games of the year, and they won those games. If that tells you anything. Now, when they played Tennessee, he had 0.
Jason, you're going sidebar.
Did I lose you there for a second?
You did. And they lost Notre Dame game, right? They lost the bowl game there at the end of the season. But to your point.
Oh, that's right. That was close. But yeah. So here's the thing. They you know, if he does what he has historically done, I think there's a chance to get him to turn it over 2 or 3 times in this game, and that changes this game radically.
Greg, you want to follow there? I mean, I think, you know, I don't want to start 2023 thinking about 2022 and quarterbacks that weren't very good having a lot of success, even though that'll be a talking point later, but building off Jason.
Well, look, I mean, the last 2 talking points that we've had, I talked about the defensive line needing to step up against the weak South Carolina offensive line, and Jason just kind of laid it out there with Spencer. I mean, as much of the off seasons we spent talking about Tim Cross's unit, I mean, this is going to be the story of the game. I'm going to provide you a little bit more in-depth stats on Spencer Rattler because Jason got us going in the right direction there. But when we look at Drake Maye, right, last year when he was kept clean, he had a 93.8 rating in Pro Football Focus. Elite stuff. Really good. Under pressure, he was a good bit below that. He's at 65. But that's still pretty good under pressure. I mean, that, you know, it's difficult to play well when you got guys on top of you. Spencer Rattler, when he's good, he's really good. When he's kept clean, he had an 85.7 rating, which is really good. Not quite Drake Maye, but it's up there. However, under pressure, he had a 28.9 rating.
Wow.
Which is terrible. Completed 33% of his passes, 6 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. The defensive line stats, and Jason may want to jump in here as well, were not good at all last year for North Carolina. And one point that Jason made over and over again, and I'll let him expand if he wants to, it wasn't that North Carolina didn't blitz. They did blitz. They just couldn't ever get home. And that starts up front, right? Because if your defensive line is not able to generate pressure with just 4 guys, you have no choice but to send somebody else to try to get pressure. Because if you let Spencer Rattler sit in the pocket untouched, and he's got Nick Harbor, who is 6'5", 240, and runs a 10-2-100 as a true freshman, he's going to eat you up. Juice Wells was first team all SEC last year at wide receiver. He'll eat you up. You got to get pressure on Spencer. And, I mean, South Carolina is ripe for the taking with the offensive line issues they've got, with Spencer not playing well under pressure. But Carolina has to capitalize. They have to get to him some way, somehow. We didn't see it last year. That's got to start. That's got to change starting on Saturday night.
Jason, it sort of tees it up, and I don't want to talk about what Carolina does yet. We'll talk about that when I do the break here in a minute. But is North Carolina's defensive line the most important position group on the field Saturday night for North Carolina to win the game?
Well, I mean,
for North Carolina to win the South Carolina game.
Yeah, generally, you know, we've been doing this podcast for what, 10 years now together? Is that right?
Yes, at least. Yep.
I think I've been kind of a broken record on this point, that, you know, if you're going to break down the most important places to be good, starts at the quarterback position. You got to be good at quarterback, or you're probably not going to be very good as a team. And after that, it's the line of scrimmage, especially on defense. It's quarterback, defensive line, cornerback, and wide receiver is where you build your team. If you're good in those 4 spots, you can cause a lot of problems despite having weaknesses elsewhere. So yeah, I mean, I think the defensive line is probably the most important, with a close 1B being the cornerback position. But I think the cornerback position, based on what I saw in practice, because I know Carolina's wide receivers that were out there in practice are pretty good. And I know Drake Maye can throw the rock. I'm pretty confident in Carolina's corners coming into this game. I think they're going to be pretty good. But, you know, the defensive line is the question mark. And that makes them, to me, the difference between winning and losing. And Greg, you teed it up for me, like you said. Here's some fun numbers, repeating a little bit of what we did last night. Last night, we talked about the havoc rate caused when Carolina blitzed. Carolina's havoc rate when blitzing was 9.8%. less than 10% of blitzes did they do anything that caused any sort of havoc for the offense. That's not good, right? And that was third worst in the country, ahead of USF and Charlotte, right? Defensive success rate when blitzing was 52.0, which was 112th in the country. That's why they didn't blitz very much, because teams could rely on, first of all, them not doing a great job of getting home and creating sacks and getting quite as much out of that as you'd think. Although, interesting thing, their ratio of blitzes to sacks was actually higher than average nationally. But what they gave up in the passing game and in the running game when they blitzed overall was worse. So they did actually get some sacks. It's just when they didn't get sacks, it went very badly for the defense last year. So that's where the combination of coverage and getting a little bit of additional pressure is really key. And the thing is, it's not about blitzing here as much as it is, can you get sufficient pressure? You don't need to sack Spencer Rattler. You need to make him uncomfortable. This is a guy that does not like when there's people at his feet. He does not like it when he feels, compressed in the pocket. He's pretty good on the move. He can, make a lot of different throws. If you let him outside of contain, he moves pretty well and all of that. And if you don't affect him at all and you let him play 7-on-7, he's really good. But if you can just make him deal with a little bit of discomfort in terms of you can't step into this throw, or a little bit of compression, or, got to slide this way. And then you have to force him to throw into some tight coverage. Then you're going to see some struggles. And to me, that is really where this ball game is most likely going to be decided.
Yeah, I mean, if you're blitzing and you're getting 9% havoc rate, you might as well just run the guy off the side of the field and you take him out of coverage and all. And Greg, that was what was interesting talking to Chizik as the year went on last year. He said, we're going to do what we're able to do. I'm not just going to do it because people think we need to do it. And to Jason's point, they basically couldn't. So my question is, how much of it do they do Saturday, do you think? Or do they wait and see what they've got on the back end? Jason's very confident in the corners. Where are we on the confidence level per Jason Staples, on his picks, confidence level in North Carolina's corners to support those blitzes or those opportunities to get to Rattler?
Well, I think it really is going to depend on health, right? Because we know a lot of these guys in the secondary for North Carolina have been banged up in training camp. How healthy is everybody? Is Huzzy going to be your stud number one cornerback? Is he going to have to play inside at nickel some, or at what they call it, the star position? If you've got to move him inside some, well, now you're talking about Marcus Allen, who's a young guy, and Tayon Holloway, who's a redshirt freshman. Those are very young guys having to play a lot of snaps, if Huzzy's not able to play on the outside the whole time. So I think those are important questions. It's one of those things where if you don't have enough talent in the secondary last year, have you upgraded enough this year to make that big of a difference? And yes, Huzzy, we know their returns on him have been very positive. But you're still starting a lot of the same guys at safety, and you got some young guys, as I mentioned, with Holloway and Allen, who are having to play, and your backup stars was a running back last year. So can you expect that big of a turnaround if you're really just relying on one guy to come in and make a big difference? And that's really the question. So I know Chizik talked about that. A lot of it, though, I think is kind of scheme. And so you have to be a little bit more aggressive. You have to do things differently to get different results. If you keep wanting to do the exact same thing, you're going to have some problems. And what have we heard about for years now at North Carolina on the defensive line? The ability to get somebody after the pass rushers. That's something that Mac Brown has talked about year after year after year. And so where does that come from? And we know Kamon Rucker is the guy that can do that. But who else? Who else is going to step up? Because if you get somebody who all of a sudden can be consistent at getting pressure and making the offensive line and the offense as a whole say, hey, this guy's a problem. We've got to help over here. When's the last time Carolina had somebody like that on the defensive line? That's what has to happen, because once you have that, then everything opens up. And, are there enough pieces in place to be able to do that? Or does Chizik have to get creative in how he schemes things up to cover some of those things? Jay Bateman always talked about, if we don't have pieces, we got to scheme around it, right? You have to have simulated pressure at times if you can't get real pressure. So all these things go into it, but it goes back to the very beginning of what we talked about, Tommy. It's time for some of these kids to really grow up and play up to their expected talent ranking. Now, some of these guys may never get there, but they should be better up front than what they have been. There's enough talent here for these guys to be productive. And if you're good up front, that makes the backside look so much better. And so, I think he's got to be careful about what coaches say and how that kind of stuff plays out.
Yep. It's time to talk about Johnny T-Shirt. JohnnyT-Shirt.com. Somebody was in the chat saying, here it comes. And it is. They're our sponsors. We got to talk about them. They're our friends. They're your friends if you're an Inside Carolina Premium subscriber. I said it last night. I've said it several times this week. I've said it 100 times this year. Go see them on Franklin Street. Go support them. And if you can't get to Franklin Street, order it online. It's the same great customer service. And, of course, they deliver it to your door. I'm still fascinating. That, old as I am, and I'm joking, but you can order stuff and somebody will bring it to your door. I mean, that's pretty awesome, And then so, they don't do it on a Pony Express anymore. They do it with a million trucks from everywhere. But Johnny T-Shirt, hook them up, take care of them, wear that gear. When you come down to Frothy Beard Brewery on 1200 South Graham Street before the game, check out the Inside Carolina Live tailgate from 4:30 to 6:30 and support us, support the brewery, support Mike and all the people that are putting on the great tailgate. Right now, the national guys on the audio version are going to pay the bills. It's the game plan, first one of the season. Okay, Jason, I'm going to bring you back in here on the game plan. South Carolina edition, critical opener for the Tar Heels. Let's get right into the actual game plan. Now, it's funny. You mentioned how long we've been doing these shows. For a while there, we got in a pretty solid run of what we said, or specifically what you guys said was going to happened on Saturday. So let's talk about it. And let's start on the defensive side of the ball. How does North Carolina get this job done in the front seven? I'm gonna let you talk about them first because I know you'd like the back end, or at least on the edges on the back. Front seven for North Carolina. Go.
Well, I think the first thing that you got to focus on there is you've got to make sure that South Carolina has as little success running the football as they did most of last year. So it really starts on first and second down. And, every coordinator that Carolina's had has been truthful on this. Look, why can't you get pass rush? Why aren't you managing to get people, on the ground in the pocket? Well, when it's 3rd and 3, you're not going to get a lot of sacks, right? That's what you keep hearing, and that's true. So one thing that again I looked at when I was going through the numbers for this game was South Carolina's rushing log last year. Greg, I know you looked at this. Rushing yards per attempt last year for South Carolina. Tommy, you got a guess on their season total?
Oh, I had
yards
it
per attempt.
Yeah. Hold on a second. I can tell you. 3.8.
Yeah, 3.76 yards per attempt rushing. Right. That's 1.38 against Arkansas, 2.47 against the common opponent in Georgia State, 3.07. That's actually pretty good against Georgia. You go down the list, 3.37 against A&M, 1.39 against Missouri, 5.94 at Vandy, and then get down to 4.03 in a blowout against Tennessee, 1.77 against Clemson. Clemson's pretty good up front. 2.95 against Notre Dame. You got to have them in similar space in terms of running the football first and foremost. And I think that means you're going to try to get as much out of Kamen Rucker on the field. You're going to have your big D line on the field on first and second down. You're going to have Rucker, you're going to have Des Evans, and then you're going to have your two big defensive tackles. Those guys will rotate, and those guys have to eat up those blocks. So that's number one. And I think you basically try to play pretty straightforward. Just let those guys get upfield and try to create enough havoc that it's going to be a problem and move on from there. Now, it's after that you've got a chance. And I do think you're going to see some things trying to get pressure on Rattler. I think they're going to be more aggressive in terms of if they can get, second and 8, third and 7 stuff. I think you're going to see more aggression and more blitz stuff in this game than you've seen from Gene Chizik at Carolina, because I think they believe in their corners. And it's not just Huzzy that I think is pretty good. I think Tayon Holloway is good enough that you feel like he can cover better than what you had out there last year. And, I think that's between Holloway and Allen, I think you're still generally a little bit better than you were last year on the outside. And I think you're going to see Huzzy a lot on the inside regardless, just because he's so good as a slot corner. And a lot of teams are going to run 11 personnel. So you just lock down that slot. And if you can lock down the slot with a guy and then trust your two outside corners, that frees you up to be more exotic with some of the other spots. So I think you're going to see some of that in this game, but emphasis on shutting down the run and clogging some things on first down. And then, again, I think Huzzy trying to lock down, they're going to let him go one-on-one with whoever's in the slot, and they'll be creative from there.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't get a couple comments from the chat. First of all, somebody says, Jason in the bathroom. and then this might be one of the low-key good. He's in the vents at the FSU Board of Trustees meeting room, given the news that's sort of trickling out of the ACC presidents' meetings here. I guess, coming up, I saw that they're meeting on Friday night. It's interesting. They can meet about that stuff on Labor Day weekend. Greg, tell me who in Carolina's front, who's the most important player on Saturday? We'll go front seven.
It's a very good question, Tommy. I'd like to be able to point out one guy. The guy we pointed out last year a lot was Miles Murphy, and I know he was banged up a good bit last year. I think he's the most talented guy up front that North Carolina has. It's got to be somebody in the defensive line, the defensive tackle room, right? So Kevin Hester probably doesn't get enough credit for what he's done. But I think those two, Miles Murphy's probably the number one guy. Look, and I'll just kind of echo what Jason said. As we've already talked about, Spencer Rattler, when he's put under pressure, doesn't perform very well. You've got a new offensive coordinator who spent 2 years at Arkansas with Sam Pittman. He's been in the NFL for about 2 decades prior. He's been an offensive coordinator for 7 years at the NFL level. So he's got a lot of experience and knowledge. And South Carolina is 12-1 under Shane Beamer when they rush for at least 100 yards in a game. And when you think about that offensive line, Carolina's seeing that and thinking the same thing that I've already laid out, like, hey, they're vulnerable there. So if we can get pressure up front, create havoc for that offensive line, everything kind of works in our favor. And so what South Carolina is going to do, as Jason said, they're going to want to try to run the ball. When you look at kind of what they have in the running back room, Juju McDowell is their leading rusher coming back. He had 219 yards last year. However, people may remember this name, DeCarrion Joyner.
Quarterback, right?
He was 9 of 9 for 160 yards against Carolina in the Mayo Bowl. How about that? But was wide receiver last year, didn't play much. They did get him in. I think he was 5 of 6 passing with a touchdown as a wide receiver. So there's some of your trickery. But they've moved him, and right now he's listed as the starter at running back. The big guy, 6'1", 229. So they like what he can do. And so I think you're going to see South Carolina going to try to establish early that, hey, we understand there may be some issues up front, but we're going to have success running the ball, and we're going to make North Carolina, who has not been very good up front, stop us. Because if they can get into these situations where they've got 3rd and 5, 3rd and 4, look out, because Spencer Rattler is going to have some time to throw the ball, and it's going to be problematic for North Carolina. And so I think that's the plan. I think this is pretty simple for North Carolina defensively, is you have to be able to limit what South Carolina wants to do running the ball. If you can do that, you're going to have a really good game statistically, and it's going to be a pretty easy game for the Tar Heels overall. But if South Carolina can take the approach of keeping it slow-paced, moving the change, giving Spencer Rattler opportunities to throw when he's not under duress, well, that changes things, and that puts a lot of pressure on Drake Maye to score a lot of points.
Jason, I muted you earlier when you were crawling out of the vent there. Unmuted you just then. What's the defensive game plan for Gene Chizik? Well, I mean, what's going on here? It's got to be significantly different than it was last year. How does that happen on Saturday?
You think the game plan has to be significantly different?
The production plan has to be significant.
Yeah, the production plan has to be different. I don't know that. I mean, a lot of what they did last year, they're still going to keep trying to do. It's just a matter of, okay, if you're going to rush 4 with, quarters behind it or cover 7 behind it, or, some version of, they ran decent number of coverages last year. But, whatever coverage behind it, well, whatever 4 you're bringing have to be more productive in what they're doing. The difference in production is not going to be as much about differences in scheme. It's going to be much more about differences in whether or not a guy like Myles Murphy gets pressure, whether or not the defensive tackle opposite him is able to hug himself into a double team to prevent, the guy that should be helping on Myles Murphy to be able to get to him. That's the sort of thing that they're trying to work on, is making sure that the guy that they want to be one-on-one, okay, Rucker is going to be one-on-one. How can we make sure that Rucker doesn't get chipped or doesn't get help? That whoever he's up against isn't getting help from somewhere. How can you make sure that happens? That's the stuff that they're trying to really work hard on. And they did a lot of work on that in spring and in camp. But again, it's all about, can they get those guys up front to do better than they did last year in those very same scenarios. I don't think you want to, to put yourself in a, bring 7, the old video game thing of punt block, run punt block. I don't think you want to do that, but I mean, I do think you're going to see them test their corners early. I think they're going to want to see, okay, can we cover these guys single on early downs? Do we feel comfortable, with those guys, or is somebody popping open and it might be dangerous later? I think you're going to see some of that early, but I think generally speaking, it's going to look a lot like what you've seen schematically from Carolina the last 3-4 years.
One thing I wanted to mention, and Greg, Jason, you mentioned punt block, but Greg, I saw where South Carolina's punter last year is 4 for 4 with a couple of touchdowns last year. Special teams may well be huge in this game as well. Mac has expressed some frustration with some inconsistency in the kicking game. Obviously, punting should be good. Kickoff should be good. Coverages are different or difficult because you don't hit full speed. What about special teams here in this game, specifically defending South Carolina, trying to get a little tricky? Because I'm thinking I'm running punt safe. You referenced a Madden play call. I'm running punt safe on every punt that they have. What do you think, Greg? Special teams.
Yeah, it's always kind of that hidden factor, right? And North Carolina, since Larry Porter's taken over that side or that phase of the game, they've been pretty solid. And so I would just assume that will continue, and you just have to be aware. And that's, we talked to start the show, Tommy, about depth, about how Carolina has 4 and 5 guys at a lot of these positions. Well, that really shows up on special teams because you're not having to wear guys out playing special teams. You're not having to lean so much on walk-ons or guys that really aren't ever going to play offensively or defensively. And so North Carolina is in a position where they have a healthy and a legitimate two deep on all their special teams units. And that helps you in these situations. You do have to, I mean, Frank Beamer, he made his mark, right, with special teams. So it shouldn't be any surprise that his son's doing the same kind of thing. So you just have to be aware of it. And you have to make sure you cover your bases. And I'm sure they've spent a lot of extra time, not just this week in game prep, but also in training camp, kind of keeping an eye on this, making sure that they've got all their bases covered.
Yeah, I think when you look at it in this aspect of the game, I think a big play is going to happen on Saturday. I think North Carolina could be the one that makes it. They've got some dynamic options at returners, but it's often a factor that nobody thinks about. Let's go ahead. We're about 45 minutes into this. Jason has settled. He has landed the ship. Jason, let's talk about the offense. We're going to assume that Tez Walker is not playing. I don't know what the heck's going to happen with Tez Walker. I know that it's ridiculous that it's still going on. Just somebody make a damn decision and tell the kid one way or another. But, Jason, offensively, does North Carolina try to establish the run, or do they let Drake Maye do Drake Maye things, and we'll have our Drake Maye portion every day after for the rest of the season? Where are you there?
Well, let me ask you this question. If you were the offensive coordinator,
50 times a game.
what would you do?
You throw it 50 times a game.
Look, let's be honest. You've got Drake Maye. You've got Drake Maye for one more year.
I'm not establishing nothing except Drake Maye.
What I'm establishing is Drake freaking Maye. That's what I'm establishing. I'm going out there and I'm establishing Drake Maye, and then I'm trying to run it into favorable looks. That's what I'm doing. So I know that they are gonna respect the heck out of that guy because he's really good at what he does. And that's going to give me favorable numbers in certain cases. And that's when I'm going to come into play and try to run it. That's when I'm going to try to do different things to provide some balance. What you want is you want to let Drake Maye do Drake Maye stuff. You want to let him drop back and do all the things that he does while giving him the luxury of favorable down and distances, of being able to throw it when he wants to throw it, not because you're in 3rd and 12 or whatever. So that's your aim. And the way I'm coming into this is I'm throwing the ball on first down early. I'm establishing and I'm trying to get him as in rhythm early on as I can. And I'm throwing on first down, maybe some sort of RPO type thing that he's real comfortable with on first down. Next first down, I'm throwing again. Next first down, I'm probably throwing again. And then, I'm mixing some runs in there on 2nd and 7, 2nd and 2, these sorts of things. If you get a chunk play, then maybe you run it right then. So, I'm trying to take advantage of that and using, you used to run the ball to set up the pass. I think with Drake Maye, you pass to set up the run. You let teams start to try to take away some of the stuff you're having success with. And when they start to take that away, now you hand it off and you get chunk plays with your backs. That's my approach in this. And I'm trying to let Drake Maye come out and establish himself and show why he is, thought of as the way that he is.
Greg, your take here. I mean, one of the most frustrating things watching this offense last season was seeing the first down run up the gut, second down run up the gut, and then worrying about Drake bailing it out. We saw that against NC State. What's the game plan here for Chip Lindsey? We talked in the offseason. Chip Lindsey's under some pressure here. You've got the keys to a Ferrari. You can't put it in the ditch. Your take here, Greg.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Chip a little bit. This is an interesting dynamic for him. As you mentioned, he walks in and there's pressure because it's Drake Maye's last year. Chip Lindsey's resume does not really compare in terms of offensive success to Phil Longo's. Chip Lindsey's best year as a play caller was in 2017 at Auburn. And in terms of points per possession, FEI, last year's Carolina team was better than that Auburn offense. Now, what's the idea behind the Chip Lindsey hire, right? The Chip Lindsey hire was about, okay, this is a true quarterback coach, which is accurate. He's been around Gus Malzahn quite a bit. So Tony Franklin understudy. He's going to be more diverse in what he wants to do with the run game. And with that, he also utilizes the air raid. So that the thought is maybe that while he's not as explosive, especially scoring the ball, as a Phil Longo offense, it's going to pair better with the defense, and they're going to be more efficient running the ball and kind of balancing things out offensively to be more effective when they need to be more effective. How quickly that materializes, we'll have to wait and see. But that's one of the interesting things for me is how does he change things in terms of running the ball? Maybe Jason could give us some ideas there. And I totally agree. You want to make sure you maximize what Drake Maye can do. One thing I would like to point out, if you look at Clayton White, entering his third year at South Carolina defensive coordinator, he's pretty good. And I know they lost a couple pieces last year up front. But last year, South Carolina ranked 26th nationally in terms of opponent quarterback passer efficiency rating. So they were really good in kind of limiting the damage of opposing quarterbacks. And so that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Yeah, you want to lean on Drake Maye for sure. But if you're not balanced offensively, as we saw late in the year last year, there's ways to frustrate Drake Maye. And if you can take away the run and frustrate Drake, then you start seeing some of those outcomes like we saw at the end of last year, which clearly is not what North Carolina wants.
Jason, you got to follow there. Greg's got me teetering on maybe it's not Drake Maye 50 times a game.
Well, see, the thing is, letting Drake Maye do Drake Maye stuff doesn't mean having him drop back 50 times a game. That's the thing. That's the thing you got to understand. And the key there is if you have an elite quarterback, and this is one of the things, God rest his soul, Mike Leach used to talk about. Mike Leach used to talk about how efficiency is how you should measure balance. He used to say this all the time. If you've got an elite running back, a lot of times that means you should throw the football more. Right? His thing is, okay, you got a guy that's averaging 7 yards a carry. Well, what you're trying to do is you're trying to find the balance where your offense, where your pass offense is now going to be getting, somewhere around 9 yards a carry, because there's a little bit more risk involved in offense, but 9 yards an attempt. And you try to balance those things, right? So
you want to maximize the output.
You want to maximize the output of both pass and run at the same time. Because if you got that guy that's averaging 7 yards a carry and then you give it to him an extra 100 times because he was averaging 7 yards a carry, suddenly he's averaging 5. And you're not getting the payoff of some of the play action stuff that you can get off of that. As soon as you've got a dominant player or a dominant phase of the game, the game theory aspect of this is important to think about. As soon as they know that guy's dominant and they set out to stop him, that means you actually do the other stuff more because that's more likely to hit against him. So what you do is you come out and you establish Drake Maye early. You basically say, look, he is who you thought he was going to be. You're going to have to commit to this now. And as they start to commit to that, that's when you start handing the rock off and you start averaging 7-8 yards a carry because they're lined up to stop that guy. That's what you try to do. And I think the best case scenario for Carolina, I think Carolina wins a lot of football games this year when Drake Maye throws between 35 and 40 passes. Somewhere in there. If he's throwing somewhere in the 30s in terms of pass attempts, those are wins, most likely. Because that means you probably had success running the football and he was efficient in throwing it. When he's throwing it 50, 60 times, that usually means, first of all, your defense is probably giving up some scores. And second of all, you're probably not efficient enough running the football to be able to have him throw it when he wants to throw it, as opposed to just because he has to. And so you want to set him up to do the Drake Maye stuff by having him come out, do it first drive or two, you establish what you got, and then you just start feeding him a nice diet of balance. And that's the thing. You asked a little bit about what Chip Lindsey is going to bring in the running game. I think the biggest difference is they're going to try the emphasis in this running game is they're going to try to get teams vertical. You're going to see a little bit more downhill focus from the running backs, just in general. And there's going to be a little bit more variation in terms of what they do with their H-backs and some of that stuff to try to get some lead blocks and some other things, a little bit more counter, a little more power on some things. Trying to get downhill with the guy in front at times. And when they do go inside zone, they're trying to go they're going A gap to A gap. Inside zone's going straight ahead. And you're going to see a little bit more of that emphasis on this from this coaching staff more than what you saw with Longo. And I think they'll run Drake Maye on some of the designed like quarterback draw type stuff. I think you're going to see less of that from this staff than what you saw from Longo. They got pretty dependent on that late in the year last year.
So Jason, you stole my question with that last answer, but I'll ask anyway. But in terms of Drake Maye throwing 30 times a game, so if he doesn't do like Pat Mahomes did a couple years ago and attempt 87 passes in a game, that's probably a good thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm thinking that's probably a good sign in terms of you didn't need it.
He threw for 734 yards on 87 pass attempts against Oklahoma. That's nuts. So
I'd love to, here's an assignment for everybody listening to this. Go out there with somebody, with a friend, with one of your kids or whatever, with a regulation football, line up 20 yards away and throw the football 87 times. Count it. Now let's see what your arm feels like after doing that, right? I mean,
yeah.
How many plays did they run in that game? Like 120?
It was
probably
59. But
it's probably 90. He threw 87 times on 90 plays.
So I'll build on your last point there. I was going to ask you, for Carolina fans wanting to learn as much as they can about Chip Lindsey on Saturday night, kind of what are you looking for? You touched on it a little bit running game wise, but just as a whole, we understand he's still going to do the air raid, all those kind of things in the passing game. But if you could just kind of pinpoint, 2, 3, 4 things for people to look for that kind of provides a little bit of a difference between what Chip wants to do and what Phil Longo did.
Okay, one is that Chip is going to throw the football to the backs a little more in what you might call like a drift scenario. So on checkdowns, so you're going to see backs in check releases. So checking for pressure, back then releases, and then he's going to be in the hole, in front of the offensive line, to where you see a lot of backs drop off. But he's got a specific way he likes to coach it, where that guy is actually going to drift a little bit so that he's catching it going upfield. And he likes that guy to catch it going upfield and the quarterback to kind of put it on him in that situation and to get it out early. He likes to throw that a lot. So when I was talking to him about this, we talked about how Steve Spurrier used to do that a lot. And he learned, he basically took that kind of thing from that approach. In the fun and gun, the old Steve Spurrier offense, which, by the way, Spurrier tended to prefer calling air ball for what it's worth, which actually makes more sense, considering he was a Duke coach. So, Man's
got his shade game going this season.
But that sort of thing, throw into the backs on those little Texas routes, little angle routes, little, check downs and that sort of thing, getting them drifting upfield. His belief is that when you've got quality wide receivers and a quarterback who can threaten you downfield, that's free yardage, and that's just running game yardage. And you can really make a lot of drives look really easy when you just dump that off to a back who's going to get 10, 12 yards every time on that. So I think that's one thing you're going to see a lot of, and that's especially against teams that like to press and like to play a lot of pressure and bring pressure against Drake Maye. I think you're going to see a lot of situations where Drake Maye is just, immediately just turning and dumping it to the back in those situations where the back's going to have some of those, easy yards. That's one thing that I think is a point of emphasis for him. Another one is actually not so much just Chip Lindsey, but I think this is a Freddie Kitchens. He's bringing this to the table. If you go back and watch some of the Brown stuff, some of the vertical type stuff, so little skinny posts and that sort of thing from the inside receiver or tight end. And they'll run it actually on both sides. So it's not exactly four verts. They'll do all sorts of stuff on the outside of it. But they're just trying to get matchups against the weaker coverage players on the inside and get a tight end like a Nesbitt, who's a bigger target, or a faster slot, somebody who's a, slippery cover like a Paysor or Nate. These guys, McCollum, these guys, they're going to try to get those guys upfield on some verticals, sort of bending into the inside of the field and just throwing it right past the ear of the underneath coverage, in between. If you've got split safeties, just splitting safeties. If you've got single safety, they're going to keep that a little straighter. You're going to see that as another point of emphasis. So I think those are a couple things, a little bit more vertical throwing game just in general than what you saw from Longo, especially last year. So more vertical throws, more throws in, sort of check down type stuff to the backs, and just more check downs built into the offense in general. And then trying to use those slots and some option routes and things. He loves getting a one-on-one with the slot receiver and letting that guy just dance, do his thing. Julian Edelman type stuff. What they did with the Patriots with him.
A lot of screen passes or no?
Yeah, lots of them. Yeah. But that was, they ran a decent number of screens and things with Longo. One thing you'll see less of is that little flare screen that Longo liked so much. Mm-hmm. You're not going to see that a whole lot, I don't think, with Lindsey. I can't remember seeing that once in any of the practices that we saw where, back lines up or you see that little motion and all of a sudden quarterback just opens up and throws, and that actually there are a couple, important interceptions on that in the last couple of years. So I'm not that sad to see that one go.
Yeah, and if you don't block it correctly, you're going to get blown up as well on those type things. Let's, I feel like I've teed you guys up pretty well. I like playing devil's advocate, and then also show my ignorance on a lot of this stuff. So we're going to turn to the big portion. We had our season prediction show yesterday, but now we got to get a little more detailed than just a win or loss. Let me flip my coin because I know y'all like to piggyback off each other. I'm going heads for Greg. You're up first. Predictions: Carolina, South Carolina.
Let's see. What did I pick in the preseason prediction pod?
Well, did you do a score?
No, I'm trying to
think.
know
who you predicted.
Right, exactly. Who did I pick to win? I'll pick Carolina to win. Yeah, I think this is going to be a competitive game, primarily because this is the first game of the year. There's going to be a lot of emotions. First games are always a little bit sloppy. As Jason noted earlier, tackling seems to be an issue in these games quite a bit. Some of the games taking place on Thursday evening are sloppy as well. But I think North Carolina is the better team. And I think that will play out over the course of the year. But I think this is a really good test for reasons we've already talked about. But I think Carolina is going to be in a position where they're going to have to make some plays in the second half of this game to win, which I think is a good thing for them. And I've got Carolina winning this one 35-28.
Oh, man.
Nope, you can't do it, Jason.
Same zone, same area.
There's 4 million combinations here.
Yep. That was not the score I had in my head, so that's good. That's good, but we're close.
So Greg Barnes has it 35-28, North Carolina. A little bit outside of the norm that we've seen across the country on these predictions. Jason, you're up.
So again, I think this is going to be a competitive game. It's first game. You're going to have you're going to have some missed tackles in this game that are going to be infuriating on both sides. But in this kind of opener, I'm going generally with the team that I trust up front more. I think both teams have some questions up front. I think South Carolina has probably fewer questions on the defensive line, but no, Carolina doesn't have less talent. They just got more questions due to past performance. And I think both offensive lines have some question marks coming into this game. So given that, I default to the quarterback, right? And, Is there anybody else in the country that you know, if it came down to quarterback, that you're taking over Drake Maye?
Nope.
I mean, some folks would say Caleb Williams. I'm not sure I would.
No, I wouldn't either.
So, you know, I think that's the X factor in this. I think ultimately the defense gets a couple takeaways for the first time in a while that you've seen that sort of thing from the secondary. But I think you're going to see a couple takeaways in this game, and that's the difference. So I'm going to go with Carolina to win this. I'm going to go with Carolina 34-24.
34-24. I guess that puts me up. You know, I think there's going to be some bust in this game that's going to lead it to be a little bit more high scoring. I'm not a betting person. What's the over? 64, something like that. Anyway, I'm thinking 41-30 Carolina, just because I think there's going to be a bust touchdown on each side. You know, so I think this is a game. It reminds me of 2019. You know, I still can't believe some of the plays that Sam Howell made in that game and some of the catches. I know there's going to be guys out. You know, we're expecting Tez Walker not to be there. If he's there, great. Guys get banged up in preseason camp. It's time for people to step up. I mean, I think a guy that steps up big is Kobe Paysor. You know, I know we've talked about him. For me last season, aside from Drake, the most impressive thing that I saw all year was the way Kobe and even J.J. Jones and Gavin Blackwell at times stepped up when Josh Downs and Antoine Green were out. And I think that gets lost in the Tez Walker ordeal that's going on with the NCAA.
Paysor is my pick for the breakout player in this game.
Breakout player, Jason. Greg, do you have one? Anybody on the defense, Greg, breakout player? But I've got 41-30 Carolina.
I'll go Marcus Allen. How about that?
Nice
pick. And
I think he needs to have a solid game. I think he will. I think he really flashed end of last year. So.
Yep. And if it's somebody on the defensive line, then that's even better for North Carolina.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see Des Evans show out a little bit in this first game.
He's got to actually get it done. If I had to pick one, I would say Miles Murphy. I'll never forget Miles getting on us for not giving him any props a couple of years ago. And I didn't say it, but I wanted to say props for what? You know, now's the time to get those props for him. So I think he might be that guy. Let me clarify a couple things. Frothy Beard Brewery on Saturday from 4:30 to 6:30. I would assume anybody that wants to come to the brewery can come. There's a ton of Inside Carolina people parking there. They do have a food set up. You might want to reach out to Mike Tester as far as food. We'll have some IC swag there. It's going to be a little hectic. It gets a little crowded in that lot, but we'll be passing out that, trying to do it live, you know, through our YouTube channel. We'll see how that goes. I'm not promising anything there. Greg, anything left before we get out of here? I promise these game plans will not be an hour and 8 minutes, but it just feels like this one was worthy of it. Closing thoughts, Greg.
No, I just think we've been talking a lot for 8 months now, right? And it's finally time to kick off. It's refreshing to be able to turn on the TV and see a variety of games to watch, even though most of them are not really good right now.
Yeah, it's always refreshing to see what's happening to Florida. So,
yeah, let's just ready for this to happen. He's not playing.
Yeah, some interesting football. Carolina, South Carolina, 7:30. Closing thoughts, Jason. You got 30 seconds.
I don't really have any closing thoughts except I'm looking forward to seeing some really interesting football this weekend. It's finally here.
Yep, I think we'll learn a lot on Saturday night. Could be ugly, could be pretty. We'll know more, and we'll talk the day after, I guess at 9 o'clock in the morning on Sunday with Jason, Buck, and myself live from Charlotte somewhere. We'll see where we all end up. As always, a pleasure. Johnny T-shirt, shout out to the 200-plus people that have joined us for another long Inside Carolina podcast. You fans are the greatest. We'll see you in Charlotte. Come say hello and watch it on TV if you can't get there. And support Johnny T-shirt. Thanks, guys.